I get a lot of questions about this car, but the one I get more than any other is some variant of why would I take a perfect, pristine Ferrari 308 and turn it into this, especially considering there's hardly any Ferrari left to it. We've got a steering column and a steering rack. Even the body doesn't count considering it's made by Pininfarina. Why wouldn't I start with a basket case, one that needs a bunch of work, one with a blown motor, one that's rusty, wrecked, anything, one that needs saving instead of a showroom example? But honestly, if you pick any of those, that's a rookie mistake, and here's why.
Now, I think before anything, it's important to talk about the car that I bought. And if you aren't familiar, it's a 1981 308 GTBI. Now, I don't like discussing it, but I'll be transparent for this episode. I paid $62,000 for this example. I won't beat around the bush. Yes, that is a ton of money. And also, yes, this happened to be a very, very nice example. One of the nicest that I came across. But that's luck of the draw, because as a GTB hardtop coupe, this was one of the single cheapest examples I could find in the world. It was the second cheapest one, next to a car that had been T-boned and wrecked. I think I got lucky buying this car for what I did, because realistically these cars tend to go for quite a bit more. Yes, a GTS target top variant could be had for probably $20,000 cheaper, but that simply wasn't an option for what I wanted to build. It had to be a GTB. With the GTB comes a steeper barrier for entry. Prices range anywhere from $60,000 on the low end for what might be considered a project, all the way up to $100,000 for pristine cars. Now, personally, there were only a few rules I intended to follow. I was unwilling to buy a car riddled with rust, and I wasn't willing to buy a car that had significant accident damage. But anything else was fine. I wasn't worried about the condition of the paint, of the driveline, or the interior. An absolute project was completely okay with me. But with that said, I challenge you to find a 308 in that kind of condition because they are very few and far between. Being that these are Ferraris, most of them have been preserved their entire life. Half of them probably live in bubbles or collections that never get driven, and the rest of them are still coveted by their owners. So finding one that's a basket case is a rarity.
So that's why I bought this particular example. It was the second cheapest GTB coupe I could find literally anywhere in the world, and I was willing to import a car if I found the right one. I wasn't too picky, but this was it. I just wasn't willing to buy a car that had been T-boned and caved in on the side. That's not going to work. But I'm not going to suggest that there aren't cheaper cars to be had out there or better deals, because I've seen them with my own eyes after I bought this one. But why wouldn't I buy something with rust or damage or a blown motor? Why was it smarter to start with something like this? Let's begin with the rust.
I think it's important to start out with the fact that everybody seems to have a different definition of what the word rust actually means. For some, it's the worst of the worst, the cancerous rot, the bubbles, the holes where metal should be. But for others, it could simply be that surface corrosion, what could be wire-wheeled off and never thought of again. For me, I have learned that I want nothing to do with any of it. In my time with cars, I've dealt with enough rust to know that I will always strive to buy the most rust-free car I can in any regard, and that is the first most important part of car buying, period. But with classic cars, rust usually can't be avoided entirely, and the rusty areas on these 308s are usually manageable. Since they are not unibody cars and instead use a tube chassis, it's usually structural components that feature the rust, but it's easily cut out and replaced. If you look at enough 308s, you'll find that the front sections of the frames on these things typically rot away, and I got lucky that mine had no rust to be found. But there is a golden rule to rust. Where there's some, there's more. And if we look at Radarosa's 308 restoration, you'll see that he cut his car down to the bare bones like I did mine, and found quite a bit of rot hiding. I'm of the opinion that if you find some rust somewhere on a car, you're going to find this hiding in the nooks and crannies. And I'm not one to say what you can or cannot do, but trust me when I say getting rid of this is one of the most difficult things you can do with a car, period, bar none. People call rust cancer because it spreads like cancer, and because it is almost impossible to stop once it begins. It must all be cut out and removed, and painstaking measures must be enacted in order to prevent it from coming back. And of course, we're talking about a Ferrari at the moment, so let's transition and talk about unibody cars that most of you will be more familiar with. I found some example footage of an E36 with floor pan rust, and I think this is a perfect example of what some might find tolerable. It looks easy to repair, as though the floor pan could be cut out and this stuff could be replaced with metal from another car, and that's not technically wrong. But what you see here only scratches the surface. I would not purchase a car like this under any circumstance whatsoever, no matter how bad I wanted it nor how rare the car was. This car, in my opinion, is just too far gone. Rust will have worked its way between the layers of the unibody and would be all but completely impossible to eliminate in any meaningful capacity. That's not to say you shouldn't find it worth it to patch it in your own way, but for me, I would know that it's always there and it would be a non-starter. But what about wrecked or salvage title cars? Because it's a pretty popular thing on YouTube for folks to buy a wrecked supercar and then to repair it and be into it for substantially less than retail. But while that's fine for some folks, it's not for me. It's just not how I want to do cars, because in my opinion, once a car has had structural damage like this one has, doesn't matter how good you are with a chassis table, it's never going to be the same again. Does that even matter? Well, that's for you to decide with your project, but for me it does, and it's not how I choose to party. As a fabricator and a metal worker, the condition, the shape, the structure of the metal underneath the beautiful skin is just as important to me. And so knowing that it's all contorted, distorted, or mangled, despite the fact that the geometry may be good enough to suffice, just doesn't work for me. I will admit that this is a great way to get into a car you desire for cheap, but it's also a surefire way to hurt your overall investment, because a salvage title is never a good idea to invest a bunch of money into. With the way I approach cars and how much money I put into them, there is no way I would suggest to anybody to ever buy a salvage title vehicle. Now, this is purely my own opinion, but no matter the reason for the salvage, be it damage, flood, theft, or anything else, that buying a salvage title car is a surefire way to lose money on your investment. Again, it's another non-starter.
Now, of course, some of you guys are going to say, what about finding a stripped shell? Well, I don't think we're going to find one for a 308. That's slim pickings, but that's a fair question depending on what you're building for something like an E36 or maybe a 240SX, RX-7, things where shells are available. But let me tell you from firsthand experience, that's the worst way to start a project unless you know everything about the chassis, because you will have to track every single piece down and it'll cost you a fortune. Trust me, you want to start with the most complete car you can every single time.
Now for this example, I'm going to rely on the awesome guys over at Speed Academy who tend to tackle this kind of work more than I do. This RX-7 that they built last year is a good example of what it takes to build a complete vehicle just by looking under the hood. Imagine if this car had been acquired as a stripped shell and all of these parts and pieces that need to go back in have to be sourced from somewhere else. And that includes the nuts and hardware for everything as well. Everything from transmission braces to differentials and differential mounts, fuel lines, brake lines, everything that traverses the underside of the car just as much as the top side. Imagine having to find every hose, fitting, tab, and mount for the power steering system, or every relay, fuse, and junction for the wiring. This might not sound daunting if you're intimately familiar with the car you're starting with, but chances are you don't know any car that well, and in order to pull off a build from a stripped chassis, you're going to need a complete donor vehicle. One that hasn't been taken down to nothing, because you're going to need it for a reference for how it all goes back together if you want to do it right. And if you want to put an interior in it, forget about it. It's an impossibility to track down all of the plastic, the trimming, the tabs, everything that makes a complete interior actually work. Anyone that's ever removed the dashboard from their car knows what a nightmare it is to get it all back together. Imagine you had no point of reference and no idea what parts even went there to begin with. And none of this covers what I would find to be the worst details of starting with a stripped vehicle, because when I bought my 1928 Model A that I built more than a decade ago, it had nothing with it. So I had to find things like door handles and latches just to put the car together, and finding parts like that is an uphill battle. So imagine for a moment you wanted to start with a Ferrari that was incomplete. Finding all those parts and pieces to put a car back together, even if it's still meant to be a stripped-out race car, would cost a fortune. Far more than starting with a complete car, I promise you that every single time. And the good news is that even if you don't want those parts, they're probably worth some money. I'm not going to suggest the parts off your car will be worth as much as the parts off the Ferrari, but they're probably worth a similar percentage of the purchase price of the vehicle. In taking everything apart on my car, I was left with an entire interior to sell off, as well as everything from the original driveline and all of the amenities. I had all of the original suspension components, the original fuel tanks, all sorts of systems that would be hard for other people to acquire, and as a result, I had a lot of money to make from selling stuff. I had $1,000 worth of owner's manuals and factory literature, and another $1,000 worth of factory tools. I sold off all the bits and pieces that came out of the engine bay that weren't attached to the engine itself, such as the ignition and smog systems, for a total of $5,000. And then of course there's the advantage of buying a car with a good running driving engine, because I was able to clean up the engine out of my car and sell it for a staggering $12,000. And I know that is a lot more than what the engine out of your project car might sell for, which could be just a few hundred or a couple $1,000. But again, we're talking about a significantly more expensive car here, and I think the overall percentage that it's worth might be similar. And that brings us to the interior, because I was able to sell everything from the inside of this car for another $4,000. Once we start accounting for all of the things that I sold off, including the bumpers, the original wheels and tires, and everything else I didn't need, I put just shy of $30,000 back into my pocket for this project. And that means my 308 GTB Coupe only cost me $30,000. And that makes this by far the cheapest one money can buy anywhere. And it also got me one in perfect condition. One with great paint, no rust, no body damage, no accident history, no problems to be found, and I'm not sure what more you could really ask for. So, for a quick recap, what we have here is the second cheapest 308 GTB I could find anywhere on Earth. And while yes, it is a nice one, and it is a bummer that a nice one got taken apart to build a race car out of, ultimately the parts that I took out of this car went to make other cars nicer as a result. And the driveline, of course, went to put another 308 back on the road. But it's also important to consider what it is that we're working with. Because after all, this is a Ferrari, and yes, some might say that means they're all special, but I implore you to remember almost all of these cars have been well preserved. Most 308s are in collections collecting dust, and the ones that aren't are still coveted by their owners. Finding one perfectly preserved or even just in stock condition is far, far easier than finding one that's had an ounce of creativity thrown at it. I'm of the opinion that no car is sacred, and they exist for us to do the things that we want to do with them, no matter what that is. And now I hope after watching this episode, you are at least in some way better prepared to tackle buying a project car of your own. At minimum, you can look at the next one you're thinking about purchasing and say, what would Mike do? Because now you know, it better be complete and it better be rust-free at minimum. Anything else is just asking for headaches. There's a bit of a mantra someone once told me when it comes to car shopping. And that's that if you can't afford the most expensive version of the car you're looking for, you can't afford it at all. And I know that's not completely true in every way, but I think that it's a great rule of thumb, because the cheaper versions will cost just as much as the expensive ones in order to get them there. Everyone chooses their own adventure when it comes to project cars like this, but I think now, at least, you know what it takes.
No matter what, I know a number of you guys out there are going to be upset that I took apart a perfectly good Ferrari to do this. Something with heritage, something with value, that I ruined it in some capacity because it's an Italian classic that should have a V8. And honestly, I know there's nothing I will say that will change your mind. But as somebody that's built cars like this now and is going to keep doing it, I will insist this is the right way to approach a project this way. And now the rest of you guys are better equipped to know what you should be looking for if you want to take on something of a grand scale. Avoid the damage, avoid the rust, avoid the parts cars and the stripped chassis. Buy the best, most complete car you can every time. I promise you, you won't regret it. Simple as that. And that is why I ruined this Ferrari.